8 p.m., Washington, D.C. That's the moment everything changed tonight. Inside the United States Senate chamber, the voting board lit up, numbers climbing rapidly, and within seconds it became clear something extraordinary was happening. Not a narrow vote, not a party line fight. The total kept rising until it landed on a number almost nobody in Washington expected to see tied to Donald Trump: 74. 74 senators had just voted to block the president's latest trade escalation with Canada. And the shock wasn't just the outcome, it was who helped make it happen. Republicans, a lot of them. For years, Trump has held an iron grip on his party's direction, especially on issues involving trade and international pressure. When he announces tariffs, the expectation inside Washington is usually the same. Republicans fall in line, Democrats protest, and the White House moves forward anyway. Tonight, that script broke apart in real time. Because what started as a trade maneuver suddenly looked like something much bigger, a potential economic shock to the United States itself. The entire confrontation began a few days ago when the administration revealed a sweeping tariff plan targeting Canada. Not a small dispute over a single industry, a blanket move, 25% tariffs across an enormous range of imports crossing the northern border: oil, cars, steel, food, construction materials. In other words, goods tied directly to everyday American life. The White House framed it as leverage: pressure Canada hard enough and concessions follow. It's a tactic Trump has used for decades in business and politics. Hit fast, hit big, make the other side worry about the damage, and force negotiations on your terms. Most of the time, the strategy works because uncertainty itself is powerful. But Canada didn't panic. That's the first reason tonight happened. Instead of reacting publicly, Ottawa went quiet and started working behind the scenes. While cable news shows argued about tariffs, Canadian officials were making phone calls across the United States. Governors started receiving briefings. Industry leaders were handed projections. Senators were shown numbers. And the numbers were uncomfortable because the United States and Canada aren't just trading partners. They operate more like parts of the same economic machine. Supply chains cross the border constantly. Auto parts move back and forth several times before a vehicle is finished. Energy flows south into American markets. Raw materials travel north for processing and return again. When that machine runs smoothly, nobody notices. When it jams, the consequences move fast. Over the past 72 hours, economists, companies, and state officials began calculating what a sudden 25% tariff wall would actually do. Assembly plants in the Midwest could stall if parts stopped arriving. Gasoline prices could rise in certain regions almost overnight. Construction costs might spike just as housing markets are already fragile. Those projections didn't stay quiet for long. By the afternoon, senators on Capitol Hill were getting calls from employers in their states asking the same question: is this really happening on Monday? And that's when the political pressure started to reverse direction. Usually foreign governments lobby the White House. This time the pressure flowed through American industries straight into Congress. Automakers worried about factory shutdowns. Energy companies worried about supply disruptions. Local business groups worried about layoffs if cross-border logistics froze. The deeper lawmakers looked into the numbers, the clearer something became. This wasn't just a geopolitical standoff. It had the potential to hit voters directly and quickly. So by the time the Senate gathered tonight, the atmosphere had changed. People often imagine Washington as loud and chaotic, but moments like this are strangely quiet. Senators talk in small clusters. Staffers rush through hallways with folders. Phones buzz constantly. Everyone senses something important is about to happen, but nobody wants to say it out loud first. Then the vote begins. One by one, names appear on the board. Yes, yes, yes. A few no votes, then more yes votes again. And slowly, the realization spreads across the chamber. This isn't close. Democrats were expected to oppose the tariff move. That part was predictable. The surprise came from the Republican side, where senator after senator chose to support the resolution limiting the president's authority to impose the tariffs. Not quietly either, publicly. Some of them represent states where Trump remains extremely popular. States where opposing him carries real political risk. Yet the math in front of them was hard to ignore. One senator reportedly summed it up in blunt terms while leaving the chamber: you can explain a political disagreement to voters, but you can't easily explain why gas prices suddenly jumped or factories stopped hiring. When the board finally locked in at 74 votes, the message was unmistakable. Congress was stepping in to stop the trade escalation before it started. Inside the White House, the reaction came quickly. Officials accused lawmakers of undermining the president. Allies on television called the move disloyal. Some commentators even described it as the biggest Republican break from Trump in years. Whether that turns into a lasting political fracture is still uncertain. Washington has a way of snapping back into familiar alliances. But tonight exposed something important. Even a president known for dominating his party can run into resistance when economic alarms start ringing. And behind much of that resistance was a figure who approached the situation very differently than Trump, Mark Carney. Where Trump thrives on confrontation, Carney tends to operate like a strategist studying a complicated system. Before entering politics, he built his reputation in global finance, running both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. His career revolved around stabilizing markets during moments of panic. So when Trump announced tariffs, Carney didn't treat it like a shouting match between leaders. He treated it like a network problem. Which industries depend on cross-border trade the most? Which states would feel disruptions first? Which lawmakers represent those areas? According to several officials familiar with the conversations, Canadian teams spent days mapping the American economic landscape with remarkable precision. Instead of launching public attacks, they shared data quietly with the people most likely to be affected. Factory output numbers, energy supply charts, transportation flow projections. The message wasn't dramatic. It was practical. If these tariffs hit Monday, here's what your local economy could face. For senators already hearing nervous calls from businesses back home, that information landed heavily. And suddenly, Trump's pressure campaign had an unexpected side effect. Instead of isolating Canada, it activated parts of the American system that rely on Canadian trade. That's why tonight's vote felt different from a normal policy dispute. It wasn't just Democrats versus Republicans. It was the economic structure of North America pushing back against a sudden disruption. But the story doesn't end with the Senate vote. Because Donald Trump is not known for quietly accepting limits on his authority. Throughout his career, setbacks tend to trigger counter-moves, often faster and more aggressive than anyone expects. Right now in Washington, aides are scrambling to figure out what options remain on the table. And depending on what the president decides next, tonight's vote could either calm the situation or ignite a much larger confrontation between the White House, Congress, and one of America's closest allies. If you only looked at the vote itself, you might think the confrontation is over. The Senate stepped in, the tariffs are blocked, crisis avoided. Washington moves on to the next headline. But that's not how power works in this city. And it's definitely not how Donald Trump operates, because the moment the vote ended tonight, a second story began unfolding behind closed doors. Inside the White House, advisors were already trying to answer a difficult question. How did this happen? Trump has built his political identity on dominance. For years, the formula worked almost automatically. Announce a bold move, create urgency, force opponents to react. The chaos alone usually gives him the upper hand. Allies stay loyal because they assume resistance is pointless. Rivals scramble to contain the damage. Tonight, something unusual disrupted that pattern. The resistance didn't come from foreign leaders. It came from inside the United States. And that's what makes this moment so significant. Because when a president starts losing control of the reaction inside his own system, the strategy that once made him powerful becomes harder to execute. The threat of escalation only works if people believe you're willing and able to carry it out without obstruction. The Senate just proved there are limits. What changed wasn't just politics, it was confidence. Several Republican senators who supported the resolution are already facing backlash from Trump's allies. Some conservative commentators are calling them weak. Others say they handed leverage to Canada. That criticism is expected. Loyalty battles are part of Washington's ecosystem. But privately, many lawmakers appear less worried than you might assume. Why? Because they believe the economic reality was on their side. In the hours before the vote, a document began circulating through Capitol Hill that sharpened the sense of urgency dramatically. It was a letter from leaders of major American industries, automakers, energy companies, manufacturing groups, outlining what could happen if tariffs hit Canadian goods all at once. The tone of the letter wasn't political, it was operational. Factories that depend on Canadian parts could slow or stop within 48 hours. Fuel markets in the Midwest might tighten. Transport bottlenecks could ripple outward into construction and retail supply chains. For lawmakers who represent those regions, the risk suddenly felt immediate. Imagine explaining to voters that a factory shutdown was part of a negotiating tactic. That's not an easy message to deliver back home. And that's why the margin tonight was so large. The vote wasn't just about ideology or foreign policy, it was about avoiding a scenario that could spiral into economic disruption faster than anyone in Washington was prepared to manage. Meanwhile, across the border, Mark Carney's government watched the developments carefully. If Trump's style resembles a storm, Carney's resembles controlled pressure. His entire approach during this confrontation has been to slow the situation down and expose the structural consequences of escalation. Rather than trying to outshout Trump, he focused on something more persuasive to American decision-makers: numbers. Canadian officials reportedly built detailed maps showing how deeply integrated the two economies have become. Certain American factories rely on components that cross the border multiple times during production. Energy infrastructure in parts of the United States is closely tied to Canadian supply. Even agricultural markets move in coordinated rhythms. Disrupting that system isn't like flipping a switch. It's more like shaking a machine while it's still running. The vibrations travel everywhere. That argument quietly gained traction inside Washington over the last few days. Governors began asking questions. Business leaders called senators directly. Some lawmakers started wondering whether the tariff strategy was less about leverage and more about risk. By the time the Senate gathered tonight, the political atmosphere had shifted just enough to produce the result we saw. But the next stage of the story may be even more unpredictable, because Trump rarely allows a public defeat to define the narrative. Already there are signs that the White House is exploring alternative ways to apply pressure without directly violating the Senate's action. Trade policy is complicated, and presidents still possess significant authority in areas involving border enforcement, regulatory scrutiny, and national security reviews. One possibility being discussed in Washington is increased inspections at border crossings, slower trucking approvals, tighter regulatory checks on certain imports. None of those measures would technically recreate the tariff plan, but they could still create friction in cross-border commerce. And friction in the world of trade can feel a lot like a tax. Another option being considered is a legal challenge. The administration could argue that Congress overstepped its authority and attempt to fight the resolution in court. That path would drag the issue into months of litigation, creating uncertainty that markets dislike almost as much as actual tariffs. Investors were already reacting tonight. Currency traders, commodity analysts, and corporate planners all began recalculating scenarios the moment the vote concluded. When governments clash over trade, the consequences rarely stay confined to politics. Markets adjust quickly because supply chains are sensitive to even small disruptions. Energy companies are watching closely. Automakers are watching closely. Farmers, construction firms, transport companies, everyone tied to cross-border trade is waiting to see what the president does next. Because despite tonight's setback, Trump still commands enormous political energy. He can rally supporters. He can pressure lawmakers through primaries. He can reshape the public narrative in ways few politicians manage. The senators who broke with him know that, yet they voted the way they did anyway. That tells you something about how serious the warnings they received must have been, and it also reveals something about the changing balance inside American politics. For years, Trump's unpredictability gave him leverage internationally. Countries feared sudden escalation. Businesses feared sudden policy shifts. Many chose compromise simply to avoid chaos. But when unpredictability starts threatening the domestic economy, even allies may step in to contain it. That's the deeper meaning of what happened tonight. Congress didn't just block a tariff. It asserted that there are boundaries to how far a confrontation can go before the system pushes back. Whether that boundary holds is another question entirely. Trump is already attacking the senators who opposed him. Calls for primary challenges are circulating. Political pressure will intensify in the coming weeks. Some lawmakers may regret their decision if the backlash grows strong enough. At the same time, Canada is unlikely to relax its own preparations. Ottawa understands that a single vote doesn't end a standoff with a leader known for dramatic reversals. Officials there are continuing contingency planning in case new forms of pressure appear, which means North America may be entering a tense period where both sides test the limits of what they can do without triggering a full economic conflict. For ordinary people watching this unfold, the consequences might show up in subtle ways first. Delays at border crossings, fluctuations in fuel prices, businesses hesitating before making new investments until they see how stable the trade relationship remains. Moments like this rarely explode all at once. They shift gradually, decision by decision, reaction by reaction. Tonight's Senate vote was one of those moments where the direction of events suddenly bends. Not a final outcome, but a pivot point where the assumptions everyone was operating under start to change. Donald Trump believed pressure would force Canada to retreat. Instead, the pressure spread through the American system and came back toward him. Now, the question hanging over Washington is simple, but extremely important. What happens when a leader who built his reputation on escalation decides how to respond to the first time that escalation didn't work?